Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to be doing, I guess it's essentially a review for Dune, which is the first book that I have read this month in September. Except I'm structuring it a little bit differently than some of my other reviews for a couple of reasons. So Dune by Frank Herbert, I have this really not the nicest edition. I don't want to call it ugly because obviously somebody designed this, but not the most beautiful edition of Dune that I have ever seen out there. And I had been kind of telling myself for all of the years since I bought this book, or since my husband bought this book, that if I really liked Dune, I would buy myself a nicer copy once I had read it. And I'm pleased to announce that I can now take my pick from all of the very beautiful copies of Dune that are out there, because I really loved reading this book. I loved it so much, and that's why I wanted to make a video about it. And to get back to my first point, obviously Dune is a classic of the sci-fi genre, or sci-fantasy if that's what we want to call it, but regardless of how we categorize Dune, it is clear that Dune has had an influence on an entire generation of both science fiction and fantasy authors. It is regarded as a pillar of both the science fiction and fantasy communities. It is the preemptive work of science fiction. When people talk about the best sci-fi of all time, Dune inevitably gets brought up in that conversation. And it is a book that is very difficult to review for those reasons. It is a classic, it is well known, there are so many people who have read it, and yet, after reading it, I obviously want to talk about it. And what I thought might be helpful is to put together a video. So this will be a two-part video. And in the first part, I just want to talk about why I was worried about reading Dune, or why it took me so long to get around to reading Dune, and why I feel, after having finished the book, that those fears, worries, apprehensions were totally unfounded. And then after that, I would also like to do just a little bit of a spoiler discussion, because there are some things that I really admired about this book and that I would really like to talk about with other people who have also read it. So I will set it up so that I can kind of give my spoiler-free thoughts about why, if you too have been nervous about reading Dune, I think that you should throw those fears out the window. And then second part, a little bit more of an in-depth spoilery kind of discussion. So typically when I organize my book reviews, I tend to chop the book up into pieces and look at and reflect on the things that I really pay attention to when I'm reading. And those things include parts of a book such as the plot, the world building, the characters, the writing, and then just my overall level of enjoyment. Because I think we all have to admit that there is an element of subjectivity when we read anything. And that there are books that, if your favorite things are deep character analysis combined with a really fast-moving plot, there will inevitably be slow-paced books that focus more on world building or atmosphere that you fall in love with, because there are exceptions to all of our rules. But I like to set the reviews up in that way. And I think most people who watch the channel know that I tend to prefer character-focused works over works that have really heavy world building and that are highly driven by this kind of political plot with all these machinations and maneuverings. Those don't tend to be the things that I automatically reach for. And just knowing my own personal tastes and having heard some things about Dune, there were some, I guess, of my own personal red flags that I was considering before picking up this book. So there were some things about Dune that I had just either heard by knowing what the book was about or by talking with people who had read it that I felt like might impact my overall enjoyment of the story. And I go into every book really wanting to read it. I am not a big fan of hate reading or reading to find out if I'm really going to despise something. I want to like the things that I read. There's so much out there to read and so much that I will never get the chance to read that I really want to be picking up books that I think I'm going to fall in love with. So when I hear certain words or terms, or when I know that a book is about something in particular, then it might make me push it off a little bit. But I also really hate it when there are really well-known, popular, beloved books that I have not at least given a try. So Dune has been on my to-read list for decades, probably. And although I was apprehensive about some elements of the book, I always really wanted to read it. And so with the movie coming out this year, I decided it is time. I am going to read it. This is happening. And I am so sad that it took me so long to pick this up, but I also think that I feel grateful that this is the time of my life that I read Dune, because I think there are things about it that I can appreciate much more at this age, with this particular set of life experiences that I have, things that made me fall in love with the book now when perhaps I might not have connected to it in the same way if I had read it when I was like 15, 16 and reading a lot of books like this. So I will just outline some of the reasons that I felt nervous to start Dune. So a couple of the things that held me back is that I had heard, whether or not I agree with this, I will let you know later in the video, but I had heard that the plot was very convoluted, very complex. There was a lot of political maneuvering, a lot of talking about spice and resources and, who's going to control what resources, and not a lot of really active plot happening. And so I was a little bit nervous about that. I am, like I said, not an incredibly politically driven fantasy reader. So that was one point that made me feel a little bit nervous. I had also heard that this was a very stylized and dense writing style. And while I do like that sometimes, and I especially like it in fantasy because I feel like it lends to the atmosphere that the author is building, sometimes in sci-fi especially, I feel like I can get a little bit lost in that overly technical writing, that really dense style. With the types of themes and the types of things that often get explored in sci-fi, I was really nervous. I have really enjoyed a lot of sci-fi, but books like The Three-Body Problem, books like, what are some other classic sci-fi books that I have found? Neuromancer. Books like that I found really rewarding to read, but I also felt like it took me a lot longer to read them than it would have taken me to read the fantasy equivalent. So for the equivalent number of pages, I felt like those books took a lot out of me. And because Dune is so long, I thought, well, oh my gosh, if this is totally bogged down in technical language and the type of world building that you find in sci-fi, is it going to take me months to read this book? Am I going to feel like it's painful for me to drag myself through? So that's another part that I had really been apprehensive about and really worried about going in. And then the third thing is just those expectations. It's really hard to go into a book that everybody seems to regard as a classic masterpiece in the genre, because I feel like almost inevitably there is some sense of letdown. A lot of the really big names in classic fantasy I read when I was really young, so I didn't get time to have that build up. I read them and appreciated them for what they were, and I had no expectations going in. But I've waited decades to read Dune, and the longer you push something off, the more it kind of builds up in your head. So I definitely had the weight of that expectation as well, and wondering if there was any way that the book could possibly live up to what I had heard about it. And I would just like to say, for anyone who has been sitting there with Dune on their bookshelf, thinking any of these things, wondering if any of these things will be true, I have to say that at least for me, all of these fears were completely unfounded. I had an amazing time reading this book. I feel like I took my time with it. It took me about a week to get through the book, but when I was reading it, I was fully immersed. I was pulled along. I wanted to be reading it. If I had had 2 free days where I didn't have to go to work, where I didn't have to parent, where there were no other responsibilities that I had to take care of, I'm sure I could have sat down and read this book all the way through in a couple of sittings. That being said, I am glad that I took a little more time to read it because it gave me time to appreciate the characters, the developments in the plot. It just gave me time to appreciate the book overall and to let things sink in. Sometimes when I read things really quickly, obviously the absorption is a little bit lower because you're kind of speeding through wanting to get through the book. But I feel like taking my time with this allowed me to really immerse myself in the world and totally fall in love with the story that was being told. And just to kind of go back to those points, the things that were really making me worried, the writing style. I thought that this was actually an incredibly accessible writing style. The writing does have a formal kind of air to it. There is a sensation that this is high society, that people have developed a manner of speaking that can reflect how they're feeling on the inside, that they want to reflect exactly what they're thinking, and they want to be able to communicate their point in not only the most effective, but also the most elegant way possible. So you have that kind of archaic, elegant feeling to the writing, but at no point did I ever feel like it was excessively dense or very difficult to get through. Like if you think of the style of like a Philip K. Dick or some of those older science fiction authors who I really admire, but the style, I find that style to be a little more dry. I find it to be a little bit more difficult. It definitely takes more time for me to read through it. Whereas I found the style in Dune to be very fluid. I thought that it captured my interest very well. And it was always compelling me to read forward. I did not feel like I was ever bogged down by technical terms. There are a lot of names, there are a lot of places, there are a lot of even ideas or philosophies that are explored in Dune, and you have all of these new words, but there is a glossary in the back of the book if you really need to look them up or you really want to remind yourself of them, and they unfold in the story in such an organic way, and they are repeated in such an organic way that they start to help frame together the world building of the story, and your understanding of what's happening kind of progresses at the same rate as the understanding of the other characters in the story. And so I didn't ever feel like I was just getting this dump of information of like 25 new names and 13 new terms and 4 new places, and I had to keep that all straight in my head. I feel like all of those layers kind of wove together very organically, and it made it very easy for me to follow along. I wasn't always sure that I was pronouncing things correctly, but I didn't find it overwhelming in the same way that I have found other works of science fiction to be particularly overwhelming. And similarly, just like I felt like the writing style was very open and very inviting, I also felt like the plot was much less intimidating than I had previously thought. There is a lot of complexity here, so this is definitely a political story. You have rivaling factions, you have various echelons of the nobility who are all kind of scheming against one another. You have the interplay between the environment and the people who live there, and there are small things that happen throughout the book that build and build to this crescendo that you're kind of tensely awaiting to find out how everything is going to unfold. But at no time did I feel like this was incredibly difficult to keep track of. If you are used to reading big, sprawling, multi-POV fantasy stories where you have to follow plot threads for various characters, I don't think that Dune is going to be a problem for you. It is not at all the same in terms of complexity, but I actually felt like it took me a lot longer to keep all of the characters, place names, actions, important events straight in Malice, the first of John Gwynn's novels, which are like a multi-POV fantasy story. I found that it took me more time to know exactly who was doing what in Malice than it did to know exactly what was happening in Dune. Because it is obviously a much more intimate story, although there are a lot of characters, you kind of focus on really one family and then the other families that are tangentially touching on that main family. And so I didn't feel like it was that difficult to keep straight. There is a lot happening. There is a lot of moving behind the scenes. There is a lot of slow but purposeful unfolding of the story. There are a lot of scenes that you just get an interaction between two characters, and you need to tease out the subtleties of what they're saying to one another and how that impacts the overall story and why that was important. But I at least did not feel at any point that I was completely drowning in story that I had to try to piece together or untangle. It all felt like it fit together very organically. It fit together very well. And I thought it was actually really exciting. And so one of the people that really disliked this book was my husband. And he is a very plot-focused fantasy or science fiction reader. He has a much lower tolerance for that kind of slow, unfurling story than I do. And I am really sorry, but I have to disagree with his belief that Dune was boring. I thought that it was really exciting. Like I said, I just kept wanting to read and find out what happened. I've also seen other reviewers say, like, I really enjoyed this chunk, like either the beginning or the middle, or this felt slow. And I don't know, I wish that I could provide you with a more in-depth discussion of the pacing of each individual part, but I honestly felt like the whole novel flowed very well. I did not feel like there was even a slow section. I was so engaged with everything that was happening that I could not tell you of the 4 parts of the novel if I felt like one dragged behind the others, because I just was perpetually wanting to turn the page. So if you have been like me, and you have been nervous that Dune is going to be overly complex, that it is going to be boring, that it is going to be a disappointment, I can at least provide you some reassurance that that was not at all the case for me. I loved so much of this story, and just like in a non-spoilery way, there's so many things to enjoy here. I am usually a very character-focused reader. This book, I would argue, is where it shines the most is in its exploration of theme. And that's not necessarily what I even look for in a work of science fiction or fantasy, but there's so much richness to be found here, from the exploration of environment and how environment impacts the people who live there, what our relationship as human beings is with our environment, and how we can change it for better or for worse, and how it can change us for better or for worse. There is obviously a lot of political maneuvering here, so if you enjoy political fantasy or political sci-fi, then I think that obviously you would enjoy Dune as well. There is a lot of exploration about identity, how your identity changes due to your life circumstances, what it means to have a fixed identity as opposed to an identity that is more fluid. It talks about the building of a legend, which is really an interesting thematic exploration right now, because I'm also reading The Winter King, which is Bernard Cornwell's Arthurian saga. And he touches on some similar things about how legends are built and how the human population can change events even as they're happening, how we interpret how events happen. And that's something that gets explored really well in Dune. And if I understand correctly, that vision of what a leader is and what a leader should be, I believe gets explored even more in the second Dune novel. But obviously I haven't read the second one because I just finished the first one, but I thought this was something that was done really well in Dune. There's a lot of integration from various philosophies. I thought that Frank Herbert did a great job in giving us a book where a lot of the characterization is very introspective. The characters in this novel need to rely on their inner eye, on their ability to assess a situation, on their ability to manipulate a situation. And at least for me, I find that often in novels, when there's a lot of introspection, when there's a lot of internal conflict, it can be really difficult to communicate that well and write that well, because it just feels like the author is doing a lot of telling and not a lot of showing. But Frank Herbert integrated this particular facet into his world building and his character building so well that I never felt like this was lazy writing. I never felt like it was poorly executed. It felt very natural for the characters to step back and have this internal conversation. And that's something that would usually really irritate me in books, because I want the characters' actions and reactions and their arcs to show me how they feel and what their beliefs are and how they're changing. I don't want to have to hear their internal monologue, because it feels often like that's just a shortcut for the author. But this fits so well into the world building of Dune that I did not ever feel that way when I was reading this book. So that is something. Frank Herbert has taken things that I typically really dislike in terms of writing, that I really dislike in terms of story execution, and has made me fall in love with them. And I feel like that's a testament to how talented an author he is and just how good this book is. There is so much. I feel like people could create entire series of videos on Dune to discuss what's great about them, what's not great about them. I just wanted to give kind of some confidence, I guess, to anybody who has been struggling with the idea of reading this book, of having had it on your shelf for a really long time and being nervous about picking it up, and just reassure you that this has been one of my best reading experiences of the year. This book, I think, is going to go down as an all-time favorite for me. It was easily a 5-star read, and I cannot wait to have more in-depth discussions about it, because I think that there is so much to explore within its pages. So if you have been wondering if you should pick Dune up, I think that the answer should be yes. Drop whatever you're reading right now and just start reading Dune. And after that, I think there are a couple of things that I would like to discuss that are kind of spoilery. Just for anybody who is also a big Dune fan, I always love hearing what people's favorite parts of the books that they read are. And I did a little bit of a spoiler talk at the end of my Best Served Cold review, and I found that really fun because it was really nice to talk about some of the things that I really enjoyed. I will say that I really liked, so part of the writing style that I really liked was the epigraphs. I really loved the collection of words and the little snippets that we got from Muad'Dib's life that were given to us at the beginning of each chapter. I feel like that really helped raise the tension. I feel like it helped you want to keep going through the story because they were often linked to the information that was within the chapter. I felt like I really wanted to know how we got from where the characters were at the beginning of the book to where Muad'Dib, who I had assumed was Paul from the very beginning, and obviously it is Paul, but I feel like even though that gives you some information about what happens and what is going to transpire, seeing it happen and reading about it in these kind of like faux historical notes were such a fascinating interplay. It was such a good juxtaposition, seeing the Paul Atreides that we had at the beginning of the story and knowing that he was going to somehow transform into this figure who's been deified essentially. And it was such a fascinating evolution, and it tied in so well with the themes of the book and that exploration of what it means to be a leader and how we build up these stories. All of the little threads from those kind of manipulations by the Bene Gesserit, from them assuming that they knew what they were getting into when they foretold and when they were kind of slowly shifting the world into discovering the Kwisatz Haderach. That's one of the things I'm not really sure how to pronounce, but all of their like machinations behind the scenes with them thinking that they were going to be in control of this figure, this prophesied figure that they were trying to bring to life, and then seeing what we actually were given in terms of Paul's evolution was such an interesting contrast, and it was so satisfying because I think it's always really rewarding when you have these people who are scheming in the background and manipulating people and manipulating their lives, whether or not they think it's for the good of mankind or the good of that individual person, and then seeing how that actually turns out. I always really enjoy that. And I think we even got an element of that from Jessica, because I really liked that realization that she has at the end of the novel when she thinks, I have had a big part in making Paul into what he has become. And I really, really liked the moment where she finally thinks, okay, you should marry Chani if that's what you want. Like, she's kind of been having all of these manipulative thoughts in the background about who Paul should marry and why and what he should do and how she can subtly influence him in the direction that she feels that he can go. When she is finally able to realize that, Paul is a person on top of being this figure, and she's able to kind of let go of her own internal motivations and allow what he wants to have happen. I thought that was a really big moment for her character. I really love Jessica. She was definitely a big favorite for me throughout the book, and I really liked seeing her evolution as well and how her story changed. But I thought that was probably one of my favorite moments with her, is when that kind of Bene Gesserit shell breaks down a little bit and we get to see her just as a person and as Paul's mother. So I think that was a really profound moment. I also really liked the moment when she is reunited with Halleck and gets him to play a song for her. I don't know why that made me so emotional. I think it's because there's such an emphasis on this in this book, both in terms of the Fremen with their need for water, their need to save water, and with the Bene Gesserit and with the nobility in general, having to compartmentalize their emotions and be able to think and react instantaneously whenever anything happens, and having to be able to isolate their emotions and set them aside and feel them at a later time. We didn't get a lot of mourning for Jessica in terms of her husband when he passes away, but also mourning in terms of her son and what he has become and the mantle that he's had to take on, and her daughter, and how in ensuring that Paul was able to live and able to fulfill his destiny, what she has done to her daughter and what her daughter has become. We didn't get to see her experience many of those emotions, and I feel like when she was finally reunited with her friend, she was able to really feel things for the first time. And I think that Frank Herbert captured that so well when they sit down and he's gonna play the song. I don't remember the name of the instrument now, but when the instrument is saved and he's going to sit down with her after just trying to kill her, like having just tried to assassinate her because he had been suspicious of her for so long. It was just such like a flooding after such a tense buildup. There was such a flooding of emotion there that it was definitely the closest that I came to tearing up while reading Dune. And I thought that was a really beautiful moment. When I love books a lot, I usually find myself feeling very emotional, and I was a little bit removed from some of the really emotional things that happened in Dune, because I think that compartmentalizing of emotion is so important in terms of the overall story and how these characters survive, whether it's surviving on the desert landscape of Arrakis or surviving in terms of the royal court and all the politics that take place there. There is a little bit of being removed. The characters are a little bit removed from their emotions. So I felt like I was a little bit removed from them. And typically that would also be something that would really interrupt the story for me, because I like being emotionally tied to the characters. Most of the time, if a character like Paul's son, when he died and he dies off screen, usually if a child especially dies in a book, I would be really hit hard by that. But it wasn't until the very end when we get to see Chani's reaction and how she feels about the loss of her son that I really even felt anything at all. And I think that's because obviously we can't focus on everything. In a book of this scope, there's already such a huge amount that's going on that we're trying to explore that we can't look into everything. But I think that there's also some of that intentional separation by Frank Herbert, and that just lends to the world building. I felt like I could really understand the way that these characters had to present themselves to the world in order to survive, whether it was in order to survive their environment physically or politically or emotionally. I think a little bit of that rubbed off as I was reading. And then I think the last thing that I wanted to talk about is just the ending. And I know, because I had talked to Patrick about this, I know that he had felt like he was looking forward to a big epic battle at the end of Dune. And obviously there's so much shifting in the background and so much that's coming together that you do, if we're looking at our typical archetype for this type of story, we probably are looking forward to this huge space battle. We know that there are starships that are arrayed all along, in the skies above Arrakis. We know that Paul has been building up this army, that he has been presumably getting his nuclear arsenal prepared. So there is this sense that we are building to something big. And obviously we get the flashes of the jihad and how that precipitates, and we're not really sure how that gets started. So there is, everything is kind of pointing towards this big grand final battle, this big epic conclusion. And then what we get at the end is just, adolescent Harkonnen against adolescent Atreides in this knife fight. So we get this very intimate, very small scale resolution, which I personally thought was the perfect ending to this book. Because to me, even though Dune is massive in scope, like this is a huge, Frank Herbert has built up a world that feels completely believable. I think the world building was exquisite throughout. You could feel what it was like to be on Arrakis. The populations really came to life. There is a lot of political maneuvering. We know that what Paul is doing is going to have reverberations throughout the entire galaxy. Regardless of all of that, all of the eons of scheming and planning and genetic manipulation and everything else that went into creating Paul Atreides and creating this story, it still feels like a very intimate story. At its very core, it still feels like a coming of age story where we are witnessing the evolution of Paul from the young lord to potential duke to Muad'Dib to the Kwisatz Haderach to emperor. So we're getting to witness his evolution and all of these different mantles that he wears. And I felt like coming back to the beginning and this house rivalry between these two houses, getting this very intimate play out of this rivalry that has fueled this entire book and all of the huge fallout that has happened. I thought that was a very fitting ending for Dune, and I really hope a second movie gets made because I really want to see this final scene play out. It was exquisite in terms of its tension, its resolution. I could not stop reading, so I just needed to know what was going to happen. My heart was in my throat the whole time. And I think that Frank Herbert also set up a story where the ending could have easily meant Paul's death. So even in terms of everything that had been documented, the epigraphs by Princess Irulan, the looks into the future, the black spaces in the future, the pending jihad, this, what does he call it? His terrible purpose. Everything had been building. And I really had no idea if Paul was going to be this martyred figure who died in this fighting ring. And that is what kind of spurred the Fremen and all of his allies to rise up against the Empire, or if he was going to be victorious. And I think that, at least for me, I didn't ever feel like this story was going to end in one particular way. It was never a foregone conclusion for me that Paul was going to survive, that the rest of the books in the series were going to be about him, that we were going to be exploring what his character did afterward. I thought that it was equally likely either outcome. And so that obviously raised the tension for me, and it made that whole interplay really tense and really rewarding. We get to see Paul use his strengths as both a member of House Atreides and as a Fremen. We get to see those two parts of himself coexist and come together to create this figure. And I thought that all of that was beautifully executed. This fight was one of my favorite battles in a sci-fi/fantasy book that I have ever read. It was so satisfying. And I am usually a fan of the big, here comes the cavalry, huge, epic battle moment. I think that that is usually very exciting, very satisfying, but I have to say that I really liked this small scale, intimate battle that we got, and I think that it was a really accurate reflection of Paul's character and how he had grown over the course of the novel. So I really, really enjoyed that, but I'd love to hear from other people who have read it, if they felt like it was a satisfying ending, if they were hoping that more would happen, if it felt like a little bit of a letdown. It would be nice to know what everybody else thought. But all I can say after finishing Dune is that I am really, really excited to see the movie. I both wish that I had read this sooner, and I am also happy that I waited to read it until now when I could fully appreciate it and love it to this degree. And I really can't wait to buy a nicer edition of this book because there are lots of nice ones out there, and I am looking forward to having something that looks a little better on my shelves. And I will say thank you to everybody who has made it to the end of this video, and I will see you with another one soon. Bye!